Hello, everyone, and welcome. Well, it has definitely been a week, and I hope everyone's okay. We're here this evening with historian Laura Beers and her prescient new book, Orwell's Ghosts, Wisdom, and Warnings for the 21st Century. For the 75th anniversary of 1984, Laura Beers explores George Orwell's still radical ideas and why they are critical today. First published in 1949, 1984 remains the book we turn to when the truth is mutilated, when language is distorted, when power is abused, and when we want to know how bad things can really get. Anthony Burgess, the author of A Clockwork Orange, described 1984 as an apocalyptical codex of our worst fears. George Orwell dedicated his career to exposing social injustice and political duplicity, urging his readers to face hard truths about Western society and politics. So the chat is open and you can use the Q&A for author questions. Also, the event is closed captioned and you can enable the captioning on your Zoom screen. Laura Beers is a professor of history at American University in Washington, D.C., and is the author of Orwell's Ghosts, Red Ellen, The Life of Ellen Wilkinson, Socialist, Feminist, Internationalist, which was awarded the 2017 Stansky Prize for Best Book Published on the Field of Modern British History, and Your Britain, Media and the Making of the Labour Party. She is the co-editor of Brave New World, Imperial and Democratic Nation Building in Britain Between the Wars. In addition, to her academic work, Professor Beers has written on British and comparative politics for CNN, the Washington Post's Made by History column, the New American Statesman, and the London Review of Books. She lives in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you for having me. Should I just now take over?
Yeah.
Or okay. We'll see if a few other people kind of jump in, but as I see someone mentioned in the webinar chat, this is unfortunately a very timely discussion, and I wanted to start off by kind of putting the book in context of recent events, but also in the broader progress of the past decade and the developments within particularly US, but also global politics. And then I'll talk about some of the bigger themes of the book, both the one that I think is most relevant to our current political context, which is the value of free speech and opposition to censorship on the one hand, which is clearly something that George Orwell held very close to his heart, and that you see, a critique of the censorship of political language, particularly in his two most famous books, Animal Farm and 1984, but also in Homage to Catalonia, his memoir of his time in the Spanish Republic during the Spanish Civil War. But also then his commitment to truth in speech. And that's something that I really take up in the book, and something that I want to talk about tonight is that sort of tension between free speech on the one hand and a defense of true speech on the other. But I also want to talk about some of the other themes that I look at in the book, which is really his broader commitment to a progressive politics, which I think gets lost in a lot of writing on Orwell, which remembers him as a Cold Warrior, an opponent of Stalinism, and therefore presumes a kind of, right-wing politics. So I want to talk about his life history a bit and his broader political context, but also some of the limitations of that. Because I don't know if any of you have read Anna Funder's Wifedom, which came out a year or so ago, which was a kind of imagined biography or fictional retelling of the life of his first wife, Eileen O'Shaughnessy Blair, and which really kind of raises some questions about Orwell's gender politics. But that's also a theme I pick up on the book, and something I'll talk a bit about, and some of you guys might have questions about. But I wanted to start off, I had a little PowerPoint put together This is not going to be didactic. I recognize probably a lot of you guys have a beer or a glass of wine, or after the week we've had, maybe something even stiffer. But I just have, a few tweets that I wanted to share with you that, offer some context about the arguments that I make in the book. Here's this is just one of my favorite pictures, not to dwell on it, but here's George Orwell. And this is a larger than life statue of him outside of Broadcasting House, the headquarters of the BBC in London. And he is about 10 feet tall, but he's, just perspective looks like he's emerging Athena-like from my head. But I like it as this book is in many ways, it's a book about Orwell and the politics of George Orwell, but it's also a book about the politics of Laura Beers and how reading Orwell kind of helped me make sense of our current 21st century political moment. And so really it's a book about, both of our political thought and understanding, and how his helped to inform mine in this moment. But moving ahead, this is the timely tweet I wanted to share and talk about in terms of the framing of the first chapter of the book. And this is Elon Musk, who's ranting about a Center for Countering Digital Hate on his platform X, formerly Twitter. He says, which is a total scam organization. They're like the Ministry of Truth. They're a censorship organization, and they push the advertisers to boycott some of his platform effectively. But then he goes down and comments on someone else's response to his tweet. You can see just after midnight on November 5th, and says, make Orwell fiction again. And this is part of a sort of obsession on the part of Elon Musk, that his crusade for free speech, as he understands it, for returning to people who had been deplatformed by Twitter after January 6, 2020, including the former and soon to be future President Donald Trump, giving them access once again to his platform once he took over Twitter and renamed it. His fight against what he sees as government interference in tech companies and in free speech, not just in the United States, but globally. And so, as we know, he was a major booster for the Trump campaign. He funded a large media and ground game in Pennsylvania in particular. And here he is on the eve of the election, claiming that a Trump victory would make Orwell fiction again. And as I said, this is part of a long obsession on Musk's part with this idea that the left has created an Orwellian dystopia, not just in the United States, but abroad. Here he is tweeting last year, loving my new t-shirt, what would Orwell think? And then, I realized I didn't put them up, but he also has a series of tweets ranting against the Labor government and the response to anti-immigrant demonstrations and the jailing of protesters, violent protesters in those anti-immigrant demonstrations in the United Kingdom, very much believing that this is somehow Orwellian, and that the people who were the true victims, the white British who were oppressed by illegal immigration into the United Kingdom, were being portrayed as the perpetrators. And he sees this as Orwellian. And I just wanted to, link that then to some earlier discourses from the political right in the US around, what is and isn't Orwellian. And these, you guys might remember from the aftermath of January 6th in 2021, you had Donald Trump Jr., when his father was deplatformed from what was then Twitter, saying, we are living in Orwell's 1984. Free speech no longer exists in America. It died with big tech, and what's left of it is only there for a chosen few. And similarly, Josh Hawley, whose book contract was canceled by Simon & Schuster in the aftermath of his support for the rioters and his raised fist, tweeted out, this could not be more Orwellian. Simon & Schuster is canceling my contract because I was representing my constituents. And effectively, for this group on the political right, this critique calling something Orwellian is very much it's a way of saying, well, this is is shutting down free speech. This is not allowing a free flow of ideas. And, it's the woke left that are frequently characterized as Orwellian. And so actually thinking about Josh Hawley's "This Could Not Be More Orwellian" is what actually inspired the genesis of the project. I was, I write for the opinion column, or I did before the opinion column was canceled on CNN, quite regularly. And they asked me to do a piece on Orwell because they knew that I wrote and taught about him, and whether or not Josh Hawley really understood what he was talking about when he said this is Orwellian. And it ultimately inspired the creation of Orwell's Ghost and the first chapter of that book, which is really about the tension between free speech on the one hand and true speech on the other. So here's a larger image of that of that statue, which I had managed to make look like Orwell coming out of the top of my head. But here he is just standing on his plinth, and he's standing next to one of his more famous quotations, particularly in the United Kingdom, but as well beyond. If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. And that sense that liberty is the protection of free speech, then stands in tension with one of his other most famous quotations, this from 1984. "Freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 = 4. If that is granted, all else follows." And so actually I'm going to stop just so you're looking at me as opposed to looking at the screen, and just talk about that tension for a little bit. And the book really explores, what happens when, people are using freedom not to say that 2 + 2 = 4, but to say that 2 + 2 = 5. And if you've read 1984, and I think a lot of people who throw around the term Orwellian haven't necessarily read 1984, or haven't read it since perhaps they were in high school, maybe 30, 40 years earlier. But it's the tyrant, O'Brien, who is a representative of Big Brother's government, and who is torturing the hero, Winston Smith, in the Ministry of Love, which is actually practicing hate, who is asserting that 2 + 2 = 5. And Winston is trying to hold on to this essential truth that 2 + 2 = 4. And Orwell says, this is freedom. And so the book kind of explores what happens when free speech and true speech become in tension, and when actually the rights of free speech are being used really to put forth disinformation, and thinks about how Orwell's writing, not just in Animal Farm and in 1984, but in his essays, and he's an amazing political essayist. And one of the things that I hope that this book will do for those who read it is kind of inspire them to go back and read some of the essays that are quoted in the book, or read some of Orwell's novels, or less commonly known book-length journalism, because he really is a brilliant essayist. But that first initial chapter kind of then explores the tensions between free speech and true speech, and how those have really been magnified in our current political moment, and uses Orwell's writing to kind of think about how he would think about those issues. Not were he alive today, because it's not, what would Orwell think is Elon Musk's t-shirt, but I think I don't 100% succeed, but to avoid just what would Orwell think, but more, if we think like Orwell, what should we think about our current moment? If we think about the world and the issues at stake the way he thought about his own time, what do we do with the amount of disinformation that is out there? And I think that the evidence is fairly clear that, at least as he understood his own moment, he didn't think you should be throwing people in jail for spreading false information, but he also thought that false information had led to a lot of the evils of his current moment, including what he saw as the really dangerous either support for Franco or disinterest in the Republican cause during the Spanish Civil War. And the book discusses the formative role of the Spanish Civil War in his politics. He volunteers to fight for the Spanish Republican government, and goes out in Christmas 1936, and he stays through the late spring of 1937, at which point, he sort of sees both the evils of the Franco insurgency, but also the manipulative and dishonest role of the Soviet Union in its support of the Republican coalition in Spain and kind of teases out the conflicts that this brings up in his mind in terms of, you know, both which is the lesser of two evil and this kind of question of the lesser of two evil, but also a political disinformation. So I'm going to go back and I won't talk for too long because I think it would be more profitable to run this as a kind of Q&A than just me talking. But I want to give you time to finish your drinks before you throw it up to questions. So I'm just going to go back a bit and talk a tiny bit about the structure of the book. And this is the table of contents, right? So you get a bit of biography. I know that not everyone, knows much about Orwell beyond Animal Farm in 1984, and likely, Animal Farm in 1984 read years ago. So there's a discussion at the beginning of sort of who is George Orwell, and George Orwell is actually a pen name. He's born Eric Blair. He's born to the upper crust of British society. He really is of that top 2%, of those who would see their taxes raised under most administrations, right? But he is definitely what he considers himself to be lower upper middle class. That he's part of the upper middle class elite. He goes to Eton, which is the most, elite prep school in Britain, but he goes on a partial scholarship. His family live comfortably, but they don't have a house in Scotland. They don't have a summer house at all, right? And so he's kind of in that weird milieu of being very well off, but he also feels keenly his place on the social hierarchy and that he's not at the top rung, particularly as compared to some of his schoolmates. And that consciousness of class then informs a lot of his political analysis moving forward. And he's a very astute observer of the way that gradations of class inform people's political consciousness and their sense of social solidarity or lack thereof. And his writing on that topic, particularly in The Road to Wigan Pier, which is published in 1937, and is about the Great Depression in the northwest of England, I think is really prescient and offers a lot of analysis that's still helpful for understanding class resentment and class animus today, in a 21st century context and in the US as well as in Britain. And then the book goes on in the chapter on the thought police to talk about totalitarianisms more broadly beyond and after the fall of the Soviet Union, looking at Putin's Russia and Xi's China and Bolsonaro's regime in Brazil, Viktor Orban, and also talking about sort of, various undemocratic tendencies within American political culture. And then it looks at inequality, and Orwell's fast writing on inequality, and then his writing on patriarchy, and not in any way a criticism, his almost unthinking kind of knee-jerk embrace of patriarchy, because Orwell is someone who throughout his career identified as a member of the political left. He called himself a democratic socialist to the end, even as he published 1984, which is this critique of a government that he names INGSOC, short for English socialism. He's very explicit that he is a supporter of Clement Attlee's post-World War II Labour government in Britain, that he sees that these kind of centralizing and totalitarian tendencies is existing within all political regimes and is something that you need to guard against, whatever your political system, but that he is optimistic about and supportive of, a more social democratic future. And so that final chapter of the book kind of ends with Orwell's blueprint for revolution. And what does he see a social democratic future looking like? And to what extent, is this man who was writing in the 1930s and 40s, his ambitions and optimism for the future, to what extent has that been realized? And to what extent do we still have a significant distance to go as a Western society? So just very briefly, and if you do pick up the book, if you have or you're considering it, I encourage you to. You get this recap of Orwell. This is sort of a brief overview of his life. He passes away at the age of 46, or no, 47. He's born in 1903 and he passes away in 1950. He's too young to have fought in the First World War. As I said, he has an elite education. But crucially, instead of going on to university, which he could have done, he stops his education after school and he volunteers. He goes off to serve as a police officer in the British Raj in Burma, present-day Myanmar, which is then part of British India. And that experience really, more than anything, informs his later politics because and here I think you see a link between a kind of anti-racist politics and a broader socialist politics, because he comes to see exploitation as very much linked to race in the context of the British Empire on the ground as the one who is doing the exploiting. And he talks about how it was very hard to see someone in prison without feeling like he should be on the other side of the bars. But when he comes home and publishes his first book, Down and Out in Paris and London, he's sort of seeking out the people in Britain who are oppressed the way the Burmese were in Burma. And so he seeks out the underclass and seeks to understand the life of the underclass because he wants to understand oppression, because he's come to understand himself to be an oppressor. And so he has a political trajectory that's very much informed by a desire to redress what he sees as an unjust social system. And that desire to kind of fight oppression informs his opposition to fascism, which in turn leads him to volunteer to fight for the Spanish Republic in, this should say 1937, in 1937. But it also informs his continued commitment to fascism during the Second World War, when he is very supportive of the British government's war campaign, and also when he is deeply hostile to the Soviet Union's initial pact with Hitler, the Nazi-Soviet pact, which lasts until then. Ultimately, Hitler invades Russia in 1940. And this is part of it, what has been on his part a growing skepticism, not about socialism, which he continues to embrace, but about what he sees as the corruption of socialism in the Soviet Union and the shift from, this initial enthusiasm of the Russian Revolution in 1917 to a totalitarian dictatorship. And this fear that something that's ultimately kind of, good and pure could be corrupted very easily without vigilance really informs both Animal Farm, which is really a parable for the Russian Revolution, but also 1984. You see something that starts out good, this kind of INGSOC, this English socialist regime, becoming both bureaucratized and corrupted by a will to power and, a repressing of democratic impulses, including rights to free speech, and the corrupting role of propaganda and of political disinformation then in that regime. And so, all of his writing really from the mid-1930s on is against totalitarianism in both its fascist and its Stalinist form, but also against the risk of tendencies within democracies towards that direction. And I think we see those kind of tendencies within our own current 21st century politics, not only in the United States, but also in other democratic countries across Europe and Latin America. And that's a theme that's explored in the book. So I'm going to shut this down and I'm going to move to Q&A. But I just wanted to flag out, these are his two, most famous titles and those that most people have read. But the book is also particularly informed, in addition to by his essays. And I also, particularly in the chapter on gender, and I think we can talk about the gender aspect more in the Q&A, by Down and Out, and which, as I said, was his first book that he published, and by his novel Burmese Days, Homage to Catalonia, which is a memoir of his time in Spain, and then The Road to Wigan Pier, which, as I said, discusses poverty in the northwest of England. I can see there's a question that's coming in the Q&A, so I read Down and Out in Paris and London 50 years ago. It really impressed me then, and I thought about rereading it for years. Should I? How useful is it now to understand inequality and poverty? So I'll go ahead and shut this down actually, and then answer that question because in some ways it gives me a place to go into talking about gender, which I want to talk about as well. Because Down and Out gets, you know, a really, in some ways, a harsh critique in my chapter where I talk about gender inequality because there is a truly awful scene in it where Orwell just kind of voyeuristically and without particular comment recounts this rape fantasy of one of his Parisian down and outs who really are these kind of misfits that he ends up living amongst, not because he's slumming it and as a form of investigative journalism, but really because he's failed at more lucrative employment. He goes to Paris with the idea of becoming an author once he returns from the British Raj. He quits the Indian police service after 7 years in disgust. He briefly comes home and lives with his parents and his sister. And then he thinks, I'm a man in my mid-20s. I've had all this liberty in the Raj, including a lot of time spent with prostitutes and living with servants and having, he can't stay in his parents' home. And so he goes to Paris, where his aunt is living in this romantic relationship with this man who is a kind of socialist lefty freethinker. And, he has connections. He grew up, his mother was half French. He grew up speaking French as well. And so he goes to live in Paris and tries to become a writer. And he doesn't really make much of a success of it. He manages to publish a few short articles. He tries to work as a tutor, an English language tutor for young Frenchmen and women. He doesn't make much money or much of a go of that. And so he ends up getting a job as a dishwasher in a Parisian restaurant. And he ends up sort of associating with all of these other down and outs, as he calls them, these kind of weird collection of misfits, including a white Russian who's fled after the Russian Revolution from the Soviet Union. And he sort of tells this tale about what is not really the working class as we understand it, but more this kind of misfit class. And then he decides to spin this into a broader book when he goes back and he starts again kind of trying to slum it in London and meet similarly what aren't the working class regularly understood. These aren't your laborers who are getting up to go to a factory job 12 hours a day, but kind of hobos and various types of bums. He hangs out around the equivalent of Times Square in London at night and kind of, he's basically dressed up as a hobo himself. And he thinks that no one recognizes that he's actually very well educated, which is questionable, right? Because he has a very cut glass accent. And then he writes up these experiences. And so it's it's a fascinating book, and it's very, in many ways, kind of well observed. But it isn't a book that is driven in a particular way so much by social conscience, so much as just, a book of acutely observed journalism. And in many ways, he has an eye for of detail and for sort of seeing people that is one of his real strengths as a writer, I think. And in that sense, it does repay rereading. And he sees the humanity of these people he's writing about, who are people who are usually kind of written off and largely forgotten, and seen as outside of society. And he humanizes them very well. And in doing so, he makes you question the way that they've been kind of written off and entirely written out of the broader social contract of France and Britain in that period. I don't think it's his best work. I would say that. I think, it is the work of a young man. And, but yeah, I would say it is worth rereading. I think if you haven't read all of his books, I might start with others first. I think that The Road to Wigan Pier is truly one of the greatest pieces of social investigation of the 20th century. And I think that Homage to Catalonia is a really interesting exploration of the kind of tensions that led to the disillusionment of a whole generation with the Russian Revolution and the Soviet project, and as it had been corrupted by Joseph Stalin. All right, what's the next one? So, James Gardner, what would the original Orwellian period have been like with 21st century technology? I mean, I think that's interestingly one of the things that um, Orwell doesn't foresee, right? He writes about technology and the growing role of technology in 20th century life. And you see, in many ways, things that are effectively 21st century inventions that he's foreseen in 1984. So you have, these telescreens that are monitoring you at all times. And from which Winston Smith is unable to hide. He has one tiny crook of his apartment where the telescreens can't see him, where he can have something approaching real privacy, though it turns out he's being surveilled even then. Right. And he talks about a kind of omnipresent media too that is kind of bombarding you from every direction and never letting your brain have any kind of quiet from the messaging. But he sees all of this as directed by the state. And I think that the future that Orwell foresaw was the future in which all this power of surveillance was power that was held by the state and all this power of technology. And the irony is, at least in the West, right, there certainly are places in the 21st century globe where the state is doing the surveilling, but we're largely being surveilled by private corporations, right? And I mean, you see this. I forget what it was the other day. My father and I had some conversation, just out on a walk together, and I had my phone in my pocket. And the next time I opened it, I started to get advertising for whatever it was we were just talking about. Right? Or the ways in which you're constantly being monitored by this tech, which is really, I mean, this is Jeff Bezos, or this is Apple. This is the technologies that are surveilling us are not state technologies. And similarly, when we think about the kind of propaganda and disinformation that we're being subjected to, it's not coming at the state level, at least in the US, right? It's coming from Fox News or, Newsmax or, um, far left, podcasts that also spread a fair amount of disinformation. And we saw that, in campaigns around anti-vaxxing and, the kind of strange growth of RFK Jr.'s, political movement as well. And so I think that would have been a surprise to Orwell in the 21st century is the degree to which these powers of technology and surveillance were held by private corporations as opposed to by the state. Okay, Kathleen Maisto. Do you see some important contemporary issues that can be examined through the writings of Orwell? So yes, I definitely do. And I think, that's really what the book is addressing at different points. And I think in some ways the most interesting discussion, because sadly how little has changed between the 1930s when Orwell is writing and our current moment, is Orwell's writing on class inequality, and particularly on the inability of members of the comfortable middle class to really understand the lives and motivations of the poor. And just to kind of take one example that I discuss in the book, he talks about um, tasty foods, as he describes them. Right? And he talks about the way that you have kind of, health nut, types or not health, people who are arguing for healthier diets and who are really critical of the way they see the poor wasting their money on fried food and unhealthy foods, and sort of saying it's their own fault that their lives are so miserable and their health is so poor. They're spending their money not on nutritious things, and they could, and he makes a real point about the difficulty of their lives, both in terms of kind of access to healthier foods, but also in terms of a life in where, as he puts it, at every turn you're faced with the answer no. And so when the answer of, can I spend 2 pennies on a bag of chips or fries, then the answer is a resounding yes to that question. When everything in your life is doors being slammed in your face, then there is a kind of solace or comfort in things like fries or ice creams. He kind of flags up. and that middle class social reformers, he argues, have to be able to understand that mentality, because otherwise they sound preachy and didactic. And if you think back to the real backlash against Michelle Obama's attempts to create healthier school lunches, and to kind of educate young people about health and fitness. And you had Ted Cruz, claiming that if he became the Republican nominee and then became president, that their freedom fries would be back on school lunch plates as opposed to broccoli. And and this real pushback in against state moves, often by a kind of progressive Democratic coalition, to do things like put in higher sugar taxes on sugary sodas and drinks, or on candy bars. And he says these are well-meaning, actually, for the most part, and it would be better for people if they ate healthier. And when I kind of look at the diets of some of the people that I have been spending time with, in the unemployed in the Northwest, I find them really horrifying. But if we're going to maintain it or enact any kind of positive change, you have to actually think about where people are coming from. And there are so many incidents like that. He talks about it as well in terms of housing and the clearance of slum housing, and kind of efforts to move people into socialized housing. I mean, we don't really have socialized housing in the US, but he talks about, community and the reasons that people might make choices that are trade-offs from what, well-meaning social planners and government officials would see as what's best for them. And, what it means to have proximity to neighbors or a corner shop or a shorter commute, and what those trade-offs look like, and how, in thinking about writing policy, we need to be thinking about people's real lived experience. So I think, Kathleen, I think there's so many examples, but one of them is this real consciousness that in order for people who see themselves as progressive to make meaningful interventions in the lives of the people they want to help, they have to actually understand those people's circumstances. So in some ways, that's an answer to the next question, but I'll expand about it a bit. The next question is, you mentioned that reading Orwell had influenced your own political thinking. Could you say more about the important things you've learned from him? So I think that Orwell is an interesting writer because he's, for the most part, my students, I teach a course on Orwell, where we read basically all of his work across the course of, well, not all of it, because he's wrote thousands and thousands of essays, but all of his books and several of his essays. And for the most part, he's usually quite pessimistic that things are, even though he commits his life to the socialist left, he thinks things are never going to work out, right? And the one exception, which always gets my students really excited, is when they read this short book that he wrote during the Second World War called The Lion and the Unicorn: Socialism and the English Genius. And it's this moment where, instead of being like, all power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and it's all going to the devil, and everyone is dishonest and all the rest of it, he's kind of laying out what he sees as the way that maybe the world could change for the better after the Second World War. That social inequality could be reduced through progressive taxation and a more well-meaningly interventionist state, that some kind of racial equality could actually be achieved through a winding down of empire, and also a sort of willingness of people within Britain, and he's thinking mostly in a British context, to own up to the role that they've played in creating racism and structures of racial oppression. And he sort of is plotting that out and thinking it through and thinking the world could be a better place. And one of the things that I do like about Orwell is that there's caution at every turn, right? He sees all the ways that it could go wrong. He sees the ways that even a benevolent socialist state could become too bureaucratic, that people who have power could get used to power and become entrenched and try to seek more. But he doesn't give up. He kind of stays in the fight. So that is something particularly that I do like about him. And that has helped inform my thinking. As I said, this question about the need for thinking about people's own lived experience as you try to kind of help them to better their lives, but doing it on their own terms and granting them agency and integrity to own those experiences, I think is important. The one thing that in some ways, the lessons I've learned from Orwell are negative lessons, are in thinking about the practice of gender politics. Because Orwell thought of himself as right on, right? And he was really, to a pretty big degree, he was right on. He was on the political left. His anti-racism was really quite advanced for his time, in that he was even thinking about, racism as a privileged white man. But his gender politics are just, there's an assumption of patriarchy, and also a sort of real dismissiveness towards women's rights. So one of his most famous quotations is this kind of listing of people that he defines as cranks. And it's an argument about why left-wing politics, and again, this is something that still does have 21st century politic or purchase, but why left-wing politics often alienate regular people. And he kind of claims that left-wing politics, though laudable, that the left tends to attract to it, every crank. And he then enumerates what he defines as cranks. And he says every fruit juice drinker, sandal wearer, sex maniac, he goes on. And then he ends with, and feminist. And just, partially his tongue is in his cheek, but also partially it's not. I mean, you see him in other places, he's got a character who is skeptical of socialism, as he terms it, depicting what he sees would be the dystopia of a modern socialist society, and that people would show up at a factory to turn bolt number 553, and then they would eat from a communal canteen, and then there would be abortion clinics on every corner, right? That somehow this idea of progressiveness that involved a kind of women's liberation, including women's bodily autonomy, was somehow crankish and something abhorrent. And he really is someone whose personal politics were very socially conservative in many ways. And I think that has, and if this is something I talk about in the book as well, but it helped influence my thinking about how the Venn diagram of left politics and feminist politics is not, it is very much a Venn diagram as opposed to, two overlapping circles. And that you can be someone of the political left and not necessarily embrace a feminist political agenda. And I think that's something that I've been grappling with in the last couple of days since the election, and particularly in states like Arizona, where we saw, attempts to prescribe abortion very much rejected at the ballot box in the last couple of years. And in other states that have passed abortion protections this year, but then have gone for Trump. And there's been a lot of discussion, right, in media that I've listened to about the idea that almost, voting for abortion rights gives you a permission structure to then vote for Trump. That just because you have a feminist politics or a politics that values women's bodily autonomy does not necessarily make you of the progressive left, right? And so thinking about how Orwell, largely was someone who saw himself as progressive but did not see himself as feminist, has made me think about the way in which those categories really are in many ways distinct, even though, as a general principle, most people who self-identify as feminist, vocally self-identify as feminists, see them as themselves as of the left. So I think that in another way is something I've learned from him, or that I have thought about more as I've been teaching him for the last several years and rereading all his work. Okay, so next question. Let's see. I hope that answered your question, the person who posted at 5:35. So let's see, what's our next one? We've got Orwell's experience in the Spanish Civil War. How did that influence his writing, particularly in Homage to Catalonia? So Homage to Catalonia is a weird book, right? Because it's a book that was a total flop at the time of its publication. And in that his publisher before that had been a man named Victor Gollancz, who had run something called the Left Book Club, which kind of mass produced political tracts for a subscription audience of members of trade unions and the working class, and also kind of self-identified left intellectuals. And Orwell had believed that he would publish his report of his time in Spain with Gollancz as well. But when Gollancz saw the manuscript for what became Homage to Catalonia, he refused to publish it. And ultimately, um, Orwell brings it out with a small left-wing communist anti-Stalinist publisher. And during his lifetime, it only sells a few hundred copies. But now, I mean, like 25 years ago, after I graduated from college, I went and I had won a prize for my undergraduate dissertation, and I used it to spend a month in Spain and studying Spanish. And I was kind of living in a little group apartment of students who were doing similar things, traveling around and studying in Spain. And there were like 50 million copies. This was in Barcelona of Homage to Catalonia, because everyone had come with one and then read it and left it behind. It's become kind of the text that you read if you're going to Barcelona or to Valencia, to Catalonia more generally. But it offers a very specific and narrow perspective about Orwell's personal experience in the Spanish Civil War, which was not the experience of most people like in the Abraham Lincoln Brigades who came over from the US, or of Ernest Hemingway, in For Whom the Bell Tolls. But it's this experience of a guy who just through chance ends up signing up with a small splinter party, the POUM, the Unified Party of Marxist Workers, that is a left-wing party, pro-Republican government, but very anti the Soviet Union and anti-Stalin. They are a self-avowed Trotskyist party. And while he's there fighting against fascists, as he sees them, in General Franco, the main Republican government, which is getting money and weapons and technical advice from the Soviet Union, becomes increasingly in the thrall of Stalin's determination, not just to fight Franco, but also to fight deviants within the Republican coalition. And so Stalin's henchmen effectively, push the Republican government to turn their fire not just to fighting Franco, but also to squashing the anarchist and also the POUM within the Republican coalition. And so Orwell ends up, ironically, having come to Spain to fight fascism and thinking we're all in it together against Franco, being shot at in the streets by the Republican government because he ended up volunteering for this group, the POUM, which happened sort of largely by chance. He didn't fully understand the politics on the ground when he does. And so he becomes someone then who, because of his experiences in Spain, becomes virulently anti-Stalinist. He sees under Stalin's influence, the Republican government targeting these people who he's loyally fought alongside, who he knows to be good anti-fascist, who he knows to be risking their lives to defeat Franco and thereby hopefully to strike a blow at broader continental fascism. And they're being portrayed by the government in Spain as traitors, as somehow complicit with the fascist cause. And it really sours him on Stalin and on the Soviet Union in a way that informs everything he writes after that. I mean, it directly leads to 1984. And you see that influence as well, or to Animal Farm, and you see that influence as well in 1984. So it influences his writing in Homage to Catalonia because he effectively writes this big tirade against the way that the Spanish government influenced by Stalin is, wrongly persecuting the POUM, of whom he's a member, and how the POUM are these great people. And at the end of the book, he says, but still, even after all this, and even after I had to flee north to the Pyrenees and get myself out of Spain before the government arrested me as an alleged traitor, I still think I support the government as against Franco, and Franco is the greater evil. But that gets lost in this story that becomes a story actually about the ways that the Soviet Union screwed things up in the Spanish Republic. And really it does help inform then his understanding moving forward of the threat posed by Stalinism, which hadn't been a focus of his until his time in Spain. Okay, so I can see that there are questions both in the chat and in the Q&A. So I'm going to go through the Q&A ones, and then I'll try to move my eyes over. I find it stressful enough to follow the chat in the best of times, but now we have like 2 venues going. Okay, talk about what class you inhabit and what class your students belong to. So, I mean, this is something actually that has changed over my time at American University. I've been at AU now for 15 years. I mean, I will own, I am a comfortably middle class American. I'm well educated. I grew up, in a fairly comfortable background. My parents were both first generation college, but I'm not. And I benefited from their upward social mobility. And I think now the undergraduate community at AU has very few first generation students, definitely fewer than when I was first there. And I think that the reason for that, sadly, is partially because it's not need blind. The District of Columbia, actually, ironically, every university in America gets funding for their states. Even Harvard, with its endowment second only to the Catholic Church, gets funding from the state of Massachusetts, except universities in the District of Columbia because they don't have a state. And so unless you're Georgetown and you have the endowment of the Catholic Church behind you, it's the reason why DC universities were the first that passed that $50,000 tuition mark for the top line prices. The money is not there in the same way, but it does mean that our student body has become less diverse over time. And as tuition prices have gone up and up. And I find that a real shame because it means that we don't have as much of the diversity as we did 15 years ago. And developments in terms of affirmative action and the types of fellowships that you are able to offer legally have also impacted that. We used to have fellowships that were targeted particularly at merit-based fellowships for Black students, which have disappeared. But it doesn't mean, it means that they are more homogenous than they used to be, but it doesn't necessarily mean that their political views are more homogenous. And this is something that actually we were being reminded of, I'm a member of the faculty senate in conversations after the election, when there was a real discussion about actually almost the default assumption, because academia has become increasingly a left-wing space, that students will share your political views, which not all necessarily do. Though I think being in the District of Columbia, there is more of a tendency towards a progressive political consciousness, but not one that is universally shared. So Wesley, I think I don't know how well that answers the question, but I think it's a bigger question about higher education altogether, and one clearly that resonated during the discourses in the election campaign. But I think just the rising cost of higher education has made it less accessible to a more heterogeneous group than in the past. All right.
So, Laura, do you want me to get the questions out of the chat?
All right. Let me try to scoot my eyes over. I've been.
No, I'll read them to you.
Yeah, read them to me. There we go.
Okay.
Oh.
Okay. Someone asked, and this should be fairly simple, actually. Are the covers of the books that you showed the original covers?
I have to go back and remind myself which ones I put in the PowerPoint. I actually have, so the Homage to Catalonia with the fist is the original cover. The Road to Wigan Pier is the original. The George Orwell Burmese Days cover is not. That is a reprint, I think, from Harcourt and Brace. And then similarly, those are not the original covers to Animal Farmer 1984. And there's an amazing, if you just go into Google Images and look at all the covers of 1984 that will come up. There's, you know, like such a great collection, but what's interesting is certain themes really appear, right? Over and over again. One is the eye, this notion of this kind of all-seeing eye, as a kind of a metonymy for Big Brother, which recurs in a lot of them. I wish that it's in my front hallway, but my husband for Christmas last year got me a framed, it's like got 8 little pictures of his 8 book-length works with their original cover.
Oh, wow. That's
Yeah.
great.
And so I could show them to you, but the thing is, a lot of them are just kind of text. And actually, Burmese Days, when it was published in the US, was published with just like a cover with the Burmese Days, George Orwell, and nothing else because it was considered smutty, because there are sex scenes in it, and it was the 1930s. And so, yeah, so they aren't the original covers, but I thought that they're in some ways kind of illustrative representations. Oh.
And then Robin had a comment. I don't think it's really a question. She says on NPR, there was a comment by David Axelrod about short-sighted attention to class problems, and how the lower class had so little money to work with, and that impacted the impression that the Democrats represent the upper classes.
Yeah, and I think that's where, and I talk about this a lot in the chapter on inequality, but I think that there is this inability to actually see the lives of working class people, you know, necessary amongst certain aspects of the left. And this is something that Orwell really identified in the left of his time in the 1930s. And ironically, even though we're talking about a span of 90 years' time between when he's writing and now, I mean, sadly, you know, after a period from after the Second World War to the mid 1970s, where you were really seeing a decrease in inequality across the West. I mean, Thomas Piketty is in his Capital, you know, now almost a decade ago, but sort of, you know, written about this in great detail. But we are seeing a resurgence in inequality. And I think that that has then led to a political disconnect when, I mean, you look at the people who end up in places of political leadership, and, you know, a lot of them come from, I mean, if you look at the composition of the Senate, and the incomes of most of the people in the US Senate, I mean, by far and away, Joe Biden, I think, until, you know, he got these huge book deals, after being vice president, was, you know, being very comfortably middle class, but at the bottom of the senator income, spectrum, you know, and I think it does create a disconnect, you know, between the actual lived experiences of people. And that is something that, you know, that Orwell was very conscious of in his own time, and he writes about, and that I talk about the implications of that for thinking about policymaking, in Orwell's Ghost.
So I have a question which I think might be tie into this pretty well, which is um, one of the, at the very beginning of the book you talked about Orwell referring to his family as being on the shivering edge of gentility, which I just love that phrase. It says so much. And of course, class in Great Britain is complicated and largely driven by family background and history. And he was on the lucky side of that. But like many Brits, his family had the credentials, but not much money. So, do you think that his beliefs would have been very different if he'd had both the money and the lineage?
Well, I think his understanding of the world is really informed by a not taken for grantedness about class. Right? He was very privileged. I mean, objectively, he was very privileged. But he was not as privileged as those with whom he grew up. And so
Right.
it made him conscious of where he was in the social spectrum, I think, in a way that he wouldn't have been had he been just comfortably well off all of his life. Right. I think in some ways JD Vance is a good comparator. I mean, JD Vance obviously came from like a much more wretched beginning than Orwell, who, as I said, went on a partial scholarship to Eton. I mean, but I think being at Yale around people who were much better off than him, I think gave him a consciousness of class that then helped him to kind of read class into different spaces as well as his own experience, just to be much more aware of the way that class can impact people's political consciousness and their decision making. And I think that was the case for Orwell. I think the fact that he had his own class consciousness spurred by the fact that he was often, though very well off, in the company of people who were very, very well off and conscious of his own comparative disadvantage, did make him then able to see gradations of class distinction and how they informed people's political consciousness. Um, better than if he had just been blithely comfortable his whole life.
And here is the very last question. This is a little silly, but um, many Americans think that have the unfounded fear, anyway, that socialism equals communism, and of course it does not. So, um, democratic socialism is a corrective to the excesses of oligarchical capitalism and a balanced mixed economy of capitalism and socialism. So for Orwell, socialism was first and foremost about common decency.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, the phrase democratic socialism is very familiar to us, as our beloved senator, as you know, was a democratic socialist and still is. And do you think that Orwell would have voted for Bernie? I mean, we can have an imaginary election, right?
Would he have backed Elizabeth Warren at the last set of primaries too? I mean, I think the Orwell who came out of the Second World War, you probably would have. I mean, if you read The Lion and the Unicorn, which I discuss in detail in that final substantive chapter, he had a very, very ambitious and robust idea of what he believed that the state should do democratically, not, by tyrannical fiat, but what he hoped that people would vote in a state that would be hugely redistributive, that would be very involved in ensuring the creation and maintenance of the social welfare system, and those structures of the state to support it. And I think that's, if one takes nothing else from the book, and it's something that I have gotten, pushback from some on the right who very much claim Orwell as their own. But the argument that I'm trying to make for it is really that Orwell is a critic of communism, and specifically of Stalinist communism, right? I mean, he predeceases the Maoist revolution, and I'm sure he would not have been a fan of that either, right? But he is a critic of the way that communism is corrupted by the Stalinist regime. And he's fairly pessimistic about the possibilities of, a revolution like that working out in any event without being corrupted. But he is not a critic of socialism. And he is a supporter throughout his adult life of a democratic socialist project. And it's one where he sees, the role of the state and the role of economic redistribution playing a fundamental role, despite the fact, as whoever put that question forward said, for him, socialism is first and foremost about decency, and about a kind of breaking down of barriers that make people feel alienated from one another. But he also does really believe that there's a role for the state to actually make a much more fundamentally economically equal society, as well as a socially equal society. So I
Yeah,
guess
well, I
perhaps.
guess we'll all go to bed tonight imagining that Bernie won instead of,
No.
even though
Uh,
he wasn't running. Thank you so much, Laura. I don't think we could have had any more fun on, considering the circumstances.
yeah. Well, thank you guys so much for coming out this evening. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Now I'm gonna let
So
myself
you
have a
you
glass of
can you can
wine.
order the book online from the link in the chat, and it'll support indie bookstores. And until next time, be safe, be well, and soldier on. Okay.